My boyfriend married my sister, and I still had to smile at their wedding. They called it a family miracle. I called it betrayal wrapped in lace and sealed with a kiss. I stood under the chandeliers dressed in soft lilac, holding her bouquet like it wasn't my heart she had stolen. My name is Lana. The bride? Brielle, my older sister. The groom? Jason, my ex, my first love, the man I almost said yes to. 2 months ago, he was mine. Now he was kissing my sister, vowing forever under the same stars we once dreamed beneath. People clapped, cameras flashed, and I smiled, because they needed me to, because being the graceful little sister meant swallowing my pride, my pain, my screams. But that smile? It wasn't surrender. It was survival. And maybe, just maybe, the story they thought had ended with wedding bells was only getting started. Jason and I met during our sophomore year of college, 2 lost souls who clicked over black coffee, overdue papers, and broken printers in the campus library. We were barely 20 when it began. By the time everything ended, we had spent almost 7 years together. We didn't just fall in love, we grew up together. From college exams to our first crummy apartment with peeling wallpaper and no heating, from long drives with no destination to building joint savings for our future, we built a life. Slowly, deliberately, imperfectly. There were fights, yes, and doubts, but there was always this quiet certainty that we were building toward forever. Jason wasn't flashy then. He was broke, stubborn, and endlessly driven. He had dreams bigger than either of us could measure, and I believed in them with all I had. When he joined that tiny startup right after graduation, I was the one who stayed up proofreading his pitch decks. I packed lunches. I proofread. I cheered the loudest when he landed his first speaking gig. We were a team. When I got accepted into a competitive creative writing program, Jason nearly cried. He framed my first published piece and called it the start of something huge. We were partners, maybe not the glamorous kind, but the kind built on late-night ramen and whispered encouragement. He made me feel seen, chosen, loved. Our routines became rituals. Sunday mornings meant sleeping in, then walking 3 blocks to the little cafe with the mismatched mugs. Weeknights were takeout and documentaries. On stressful days, he'd leave handwritten notes in my bag, "You've got this." Or tonight, pasta and foot rubs. When Jason started working 14-hour days at the startup, I barely saw him. But I understood. I brought him meals at his desk, listened when deals fell through, and held him when he doubted himself. He used to say, "I don't need the whole world to believe in me, just you." I believed in him when no one else did. Our friends joked we were boring in the best way. We weren't loud or performative. We were the couple who showed up, stayed late, helped clean, who brought soup when people were sick. We built a quiet kind of love, the kind that felt. And yet, even in those early years, Brielle hovered. She was the opposite of me. Loud, commanding, magnetic. People turned when she entered a room. She had this ability to make compliments sound like challenges. "Wow, Lana, you found someone ambitious. Good for you. Hope you can keep up." I brushed it off, again and again. She was my sister. What else could I do? Jason always said she was harmless, that I was overthinking, and I wanted to believe that. Because believing anything else would mean questioning everything I held dear. We made it through birthdays, funerals, job changes, through sick parents and lost pets, through the slow crawl of becoming adults who paid bills, cooked dinners, and argued about couch colors. We talked about marriage like it was a matter of when, not if. I thought we were unbreakable. I thought 7 years meant something. And the moment I realized just how wrong I was, it came with a knock on the door I should have never opened. Jason came from wealth, but you'd never know it at first glance. His parents owned real estate across the country, the kind of money that built houses for vacations they never took. But from the moment Jason turned 18, his father gave him a condition. If he wanted a life of comfort, he had to earn it himself. And Jason took it seriously. He refused family money, worked through college, and poured everything he had into building something of his own. When we met during sophomore year, he was charming in a quiet, thoughtful way. A business major who read poetry, confident but not cocky. We dated for nearly 7 years, from cramming in university libraries to renting our first 1-bedroom apartment with paper-thin walls and a leaky sink. We were partners in every sense. I watched him build his resume, climb into mid-management at a tech firm, and eventually lead a major product launch that got him national recognition. By 25, he was on magazine covers, but still grounded, still Jason. Which made it all the harder to watch him slip away. It started small, Brielle showing up unannounced, lingering during our family dinners, tossing Jason compliments like confetti. "You clean up well," she told him once at Thanksgiving, eyes twinkling. "You could be a model in Forbes or GQ." I laughed. Jason smiled politely. My parents beamed like it was adorable. I didn't. Then came the constant comparison. "Jason needs someone who can challenge him," Brielle said another evening, sipping wine. "Lana's sweet, but he's next level now." My mother didn't disagree. "Your sister's just looking out for you. You need someone who keeps pace." Even Jason didn't stop her. He chuckled, said nothing, and in saying nothing, he said too much. Soon, Brielle began bumping into him near his office, bringing pastries, texting him articles, tagging him in social media posts. Always friendly, always polished, always too familiar. When I asked about it, Jason just shrugged. "She's your sister. She's being nice." But it didn't feel nice. At his product launch gala, Brielle arrived uninvited, wearing a silver gown, stepping in like the evening was hers. Photographers caught her clinking glasses with him. People whispered. Some mistook her for me. Jason didn't correct them. The next morning, she posted, proud of this visionary man and all he's built. There was no tag, but the message was loud. At home, the tension grew. Jason grew quieter, distant. His phone lit up more. He smiled at texts and tucked the screen away when I entered the room. One night, while he showered, I heard the familiar ding of a message. I didn't mean to look. But there it was. "Brielle, she's clueless. Don't worry, I won't say a word." I stood there frozen, air caught in my throat. Jason came out humming a song, towel around his neck, acting like everything was fine. I smiled, I kissed his cheek. But something inside me began to collapse. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake next to Jason, counting the seconds between his breaths, wondering how long he'd been lying to me, or worse, if he'd already stopped caring enough to lie properly. I wanted to believe it was just harmless flirting, that Brielle was being Brielle, that Jason was too naive to notice. But deep down, I knew. My sister wasn't subtle. She didn't flirt for fun. She targeted. She had always treated life like a competition, and I was the opponent she needed to defeat quietly but completely. She never wanted what I had until it looked valuable. And Jason, with his charm and success and rich boy pedigree, had suddenly become very valuable. The worst part was how isolated I began to feel. My parents thought I was overreacting. "Don't turn this into drama," Mom warned. "You'll drive him away." Even my closest friends hesitated. "Are you sure?" they asked. "She's your sister. Maybe it's just your insecurity talking." I stopped talking about it. I started pretending, smiling at family dinners while Brielle and Jason exchanged private jokes, laughing when my dad teased that Brielle should help Jason run his brand, sitting through silence when my mom sighed and said, "Maybe he's just too much for you now." At some point, I stopped being Jason's partner and became his accessory, the one he brought to events out of habit, the one who waited while he shook hands and made speeches and posed for pictures, sometimes with Brielle on the other side of him. My heart felt like a slow-motion collapse. No single explosion, just pressure, building, silent. Until it wasn't. Until I saw something I was never meant to see. The fight started like any other. Raised voices, accusations flung across the living room, frustration that had been building for weeks, but this one was different. Jason had been distant. I asked if it was about work. He snapped that I never understood his pressure. I brought up how Brielle kept finding excuses to be around him. He said I was being paranoid. I told him to leave if he couldn't be honest. So he did. I thought he just needed a night to cool off. I didn't know he'd end up at her place. Brielle knew exactly what she was doing. She knew Jason wouldn't go to a bar or a friend. She knew he wouldn't want to be alone. She made herself the easiest option. A few drinks, a shoulder to lean on, a few carefully chosen words. And Jason, hurt, angry, and not thinking straight, fell into it. That one night turned into something more, something secret, something toxic. They started seeing each other behind my back. 2 weeks after that night, Jason came to see me. His eyes were red, his hands shaking. He confessed to what happened. "It was one night," he said. "I was drunk. I didn't mean for it to go this far." But it had gone far. Because when he tried to end it with Brielle, she dropped the news. She was pregnant. Jason was stunned. He told me he begged her not to go public. He wasn't ready. He didn't love her. He wanted to fix things with me. But Brielle didn't care. She told our parents everything. And just like that, the family shifted. My mom said we had to protect Brielle's reputation. My dad said Jason had to step up and do the right thing. And me? I was told to be supportive. Supportive of a wedding between my boyfriend and my sister. Supportive of the woman who stole him, then used a baby to keep him. And worse. They wanted me to be the maid of honor. To show we're united, my mother said. To stop the gossip that Brielle stole your boyfriend. I said no. They said I was selfish. I said I was heartbroken. They said I was being dramatic. The pressure built like a storm. Relatives called to guilt trip me. Friends told me to be the bigger person. Jason didn't say a word. Eventually, I gave in. Not because I forgave them, but because I was tired of fighting a battle no one believed I deserved to win. I stood next to Brielle at dress fittings while she smirked. I helped plan the bridal shower while guests whispered behind my back. I rehearsed my speech through clenched teeth. Jason looked more like a hostage than a groom, but he still went through with it. In the weeks before the wedding, I became invisible. At work, people stared longer than they used to. In the break room, conversations stopped when I walked in. No one said anything outright, but I could hear their thoughts. She's the girl whose sister stole her boyfriend. At the grocery store, an old neighbor offered a smile too wide. You're being so mature about all this, dear. Such grace. Brace. That's what they called silence. Inside, I was falling apart. I couldn't sleep. I stopped eating. My phone lit up with messages I didn't want to read. Everyone wanted to talk about the baby, about how happy Brielle looked, about Jason doing the right thing. No one asked if I was okay. My mother was more worried about napkin colors than my mental state. Smile bigger in the photos, she said at the rehearsal. You're still part of this family. Brielle basked in it. She let people coo over her belly, made snide comments in front of me that only I seemed to understand. It's funny how life works out, she said once, running her hand over her stomach. Some things just fall into place. Jason never defended me. Not once. I tried to talk to him again. We met behind the church during rehearsal. You don't have to do this, I said. You're not happy. I don't have a choice, he whispered. My parents said if I walk away now, it'll ruin everything. I'll lose their support. You're marrying a woman you don't love because of money? I don't want the baby to grow up in a broken home. I looked at him for a long time. You think this isn't broken already? He had no answer. And maybe that was the answer. The night before the wedding, I lay awake listening to the house creak and shift. The home that once held childhood dreams now suffocated me with obligation. I thought about running, about disappearing, but I couldn't, not yet. Because part of me needed them to see. To really see. The wedding day was sunny, the kind of perfect weather that mocked the storm inside me. I dressed in silence. My hands were steady, but my chest felt like it might collapse. In the bridal suite, Brielle chirped instructions while sipping mimosa. When we were finally alone, she looked at me and said, "Thank you for being here. I know it must be hard." I met her gaze. You really don't. She tilted her head. Jason will be a good father. That's all that matters now. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I smiled instead. Because sometimes silence is louder than rage. And sometimes pain wears a mask so perfect even the bride doesn't see it coming. They thought it ended at I do, but for me that was only the beginning of silence, of shame, and of a secret I could no longer keep. The wedding broke something in me. I walked out of that church with sore cheeks from forced smiles, heels that cut into my skin, and a silence that clung to me like a second skin. I didn't cry. Not at first. But that night, as the city lights blurred outside my bedroom window, it hit me like glass shattering in slow motion. I had stood in front of the man I once loved, watched him marry my sister, pretended it didn't destroy me. And now there was nothing left to pretend. I stopped eating, stopped answering calls. My inbox filled with messages I couldn't read. Friends reached out, but their voices sounded like static. My world had gone gray. I slept during the day and lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, counting regrets like sheep. Then came the nausea. At first, I thought it was stress, my body reacting to the trauma, but it didn't go away. I bought a test, then another, then 3 more. All positive. I sat on the cold bathroom floor, staring at the lines that confirmed what my heart had already suspected. I was pregnant. With Jason's child. My chest tightened. Not from joy, not from fear, but from something deeper, something darker. Because the timing lined up perfectly. I knew the night it had happened, the night before the fight, before the end of everything. But I couldn't tell him. Not after what he'd done, not after watching him stand beside Brielle, hand on her stomach, while I stood behind them like a discarded memory. This child would never be a bargaining chip, never be used the way she used hers. So I told no one. Not even my doctor. I simply existed. My body changed, but I didn't celebrate it. I hid it under baggy sweaters and layers of silence. My mother still sent photos from the wedding. My father called once, asking if I'd moved on yet. Moved on? I was drowning, and they were worried about optics. At work, I faded further. Colleagues assumed I was grieving. They weren't wrong. I was grieving everything. My love, my future, my sense of self. And the worst part? I didn't know if I wanted to keep the baby. Not because I didn't love it, but because I didn't know if I had anything left to give. The nights were the hardest. The silence stretched too wide. The shadows whispered what-ifs. I curled around my growing stomach, wondering if this was punishment or redemption. One night, I stood at my window, wind pressing against the glass, and whispered to the child inside me, "I'm sorry." It was the first word I'd spoken aloud in days. But somewhere, deep beneath the grief, a flicker stirred. Not hope. Not yet. But the barest spark of defiance. Because maybe I wasn't done. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe this child would save me in ways no one else could. I started canceling appointments. I skipped prenatal care, avoided checkups. The idea of sitting in a waiting room, explaining why I was alone, why the father wasn't coming, it was too much. Even walking through the baby aisle at the pharmacy made me sick. I wanted to be invisible. I deleted social media. Every photo of Brielle flaunting her perfect bump, every congratulations under her wedding post, every shot of Jason smiling like he hadn't gutted me. It was poison. I was living in hiding, not just from others, but from myself. There were moments when I'd place my hand on my belly and feel a flicker of movement, and something inside me would ache, a longing I couldn't name. I thought about telling him, not to win him back, but because he had the right to know. But the thought of Brielle finding out made my stomach twist. She'd use it against me. She'd say I was trying to steal him back, and Jason? He'd panic. He'd offer help, maybe money. But not love. Not the kind I needed. So, I kept it buried. I'd talk to the baby late at night, whispering stories about colors and light and the kind of mother I hoped I could become. I told them they were wanted, even if the world hadn't made them easy to want. Once, I almost reached out to an old friend, typed out the message, "I'm pregnant, I need help," but I deleted it before sending. Because asking for help meant admitting I was falling apart. And falling apart meant someone might see the full extent of my pain, and I wasn't sure I could survive that kind of exposure. The days bled together, cold cereal for dinner, blank stares at the wall, a heartbeat growing inside a body that felt completely hollow. I stopped checking the calendar, but I knew time was passing. My clothes tightened, my emotions frayed. And one morning, as sunlight slipped through the curtains, I felt the first kick. It was light, like a whisper against my ribs, but it stopped me cold. Tears welled up, uninvited, unstoppable. I pressed both hands to my stomach and sobbed for the first time in months. Not because I was afraid, but because, for the first time, I wasn't alone. I thought I was broken beyond repair until that tiny heartbeat led me to someone who would change everything. Leaving wasn't dramatic. There was no screaming, no suitcase flung into a cab in the rain, just a quiet morning, a folded note on my childhood bed, and one final glance in the mirror before I slipped out the door. I moved to a coastal town 100 miles away. No one knew me there, that was the point. I found a small apartment above a used bookstore. The landlord was kind and didn't ask questions. I told him I worked remotely. In truth, I was still figuring out how to survive. When the baby came, it was just me and a nurse named Grace. She held my hand as I pushed, whispering words I couldn't understand through the pain, and then, a cry, soft, powerful, alive. I named him Eli. He had Jason's eyes, my hands, and a presence that filled the empty spaces in my heart like sunlight. The first weeks were hard, sleepless nights, endless diapers, silent tears over bottles at 3 a.m., but through it all, Eli looked at me like I was enough. And maybe I was starting to believe him. I needed work, something to ground me, something more than just survival. A month later, I saw a help wanted sign at a local art gallery. I walked in on a whim, holding Eli in one arm and a crumpled resume in the other. Mr. Whitaker owned the gallery. He was in his late 40s, tall, with tired eyes and a calm voice. He didn't flinch when Eli cried. He asked about my favorite painters instead of my past. "You start Monday," he said. I organized events, arranged pieces, greeted guests. It wasn't glamorous, but it was healing. Every frame I hung felt like a stitch in a wound slowly closing. Mr. Whitaker didn't talk much, but he noticed things, like how I flinched when people mentioned weddings, or how I kept checking the door even when no one was coming. One evening, after closing, he said quietly, "You're not from here, but I think you're starting to belong." I looked at him, unsure how to reply. He just smiled. Over time, he'd invite me to stay after work, for coffee, then dinner. He never pushed, never pried. Just listened. I learned he had lost his wife 3 years ago. Cancer. Quick, cruel. He understood grief, the slow ache, the guilt of still breathing. With him, I didn't feel broken, just human. Eli adored him, watched him with wide eyes, reached for his hand during walks through the gallery. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something steady, something kind. And for the first time in a long while, I let myself breathe. One afternoon, as I watched Mr. Whitaker teach Eli how to hold a paintbrush, I felt it. Not peace, but the possibility of it. I wasn't who I used to be. But maybe that was a good thing. Some days were still hard. There were mornings when I would wake up in a panic, unsure of what city I was in or what I was supposed to do next. The trauma hadn't disappeared, it had just learned to live quietly in the corners of my mind. But each small victory mattered. Eli's first laugh, my first paycheck, the first time I looked in the mirror and didn't see someone who'd been broken, but someone who had survived. I began to rediscover pieces of myself I thought I'd lost. I started sketching again, nothing serious, just pencil to paper when Eli napped. I even hung one drawing in the gallery's back office. Mr. Whitaker noticed, but didn't say anything. He just smiled. The gallery became more than a job, it was a second home. Locals started to remember my name. One woman brought in fresh muffins every Friday. Another offered to babysit if I ever needed a night off. And then there was Mr. Whitaker. He never made grand gestures, but he was there. He offered rides on rainy days. He held Eli when I was too tired to stand. He asked me about my dreams, not my past. Once, when Eli was sick, I called him at midnight in tears. He showed up 10 minutes later with a thermometer, soup, and a quiet promise. "You're not alone anymore." I didn't realize how much I'd needed to hear those words until then. And I began to believe him. He never tried to replace anything or anyone. He simply made room, for me, for Eli, for the messy, fragile beginnings of something that might one day be called family. One chilly autumn evening, as we locked up the gallery, he looked at me and said, "Sometimes the best art comes from what's left behind." I nodded, not trusting my voice. Because for the first time, I wasn't looking backward. I was starting to dream forward. And just when I thought the past had finally loosened its grip on me, it came knocking in a way I never expected. It started with a painting. Weekend gallery show, a crowded room, Eli tugging my hand, pointing at a canvas that reminded him of the sea. I lifted him up, laughing softly, just as someone stepped through the doorway. Jason. I didn't see him at first, but he saw me. And more importantly, he saw Eli. Our eyes met across the gallery. He froze. I turned away, heart pounding, pretending not to notice, but it was too late. 2 days later, he showed up again, this time alone. I met him outside, arms crossed, stomach tight. "You moved," he said. "You had a child." I didn't answer. He looked at me, really looked, and his voice dropped. "He looks like me." Still, I said nothing. I wasn't going to validate his suspicion, not out of spite, but because it wasn't his right anymore. But Jason had never been one to let go of an idea once it grabbed hold. Over the next week, I saw him around town, at the cafe, near the bookstore, never approaching, but always watching. And then he did what I feared he might. He confronted Brielle. She had just given birth weeks earlier, a daughter, she claimed, his child, a picture-perfect family. But when Jason rattled by Eli's resemblance, demanded a paternity test, the foundation cracked. The results came in fast. Not his. Jason didn't explode, he simply stopped speaking. Brielle begged, cried, pleaded, and finally she broke. There was someone else, she confessed. It was one time, I didn't think, but she had thought. She had planned. Because when Jason returned to me, it wasn't with anger. It was with silence. He waited outside the gallery as I was locking up, hands shoved deep in his pockets. You knew, he said. I nodded. I did. Why didn't you tell me? I looked him in the eye. Because you didn't choose me, you chose her, you believed her, and that was enough. He blinked, hurt, confused. I thought I was doing the right thing, she said. She lied, I said flatly, and you let her. We stood there, old pain between us like smoke. I want to know him, he finally whispered. I thought of Eli, of his bright laugh, of Mr. Whitaker teaching him to paint, of the life we'd built without Jason. I took a breath. He already had someone, I said gently, someone who never left. Jason looked away, jaw tight. I need to make it right. But some things couldn't be undone. Later that week, Brielle showed up, in a coat too thin for the wind, eyes red, voice small. You won, she said. Is that what you wanted? I stared at her, calm, unmoved. This wasn't a game, I replied. You made it one. She swallowed. I don't know who I am anymore. That makes two of us, I said, but at least now, I like who I'm becoming. And with that, I closed the door. Jason didn't return to Brielle's house after the test. He drove for hours, parked by the ocean, slept in his car, stared at the sky, trying to stitch his reality back together. The lie had cost him more than pride. It had cost him time, more years he would never get back. A child he hadn't held. A woman he hadn't believed. He showed up again a week later. I was at the gallery with Eli when he walked in. Eli looked up, curious but not drawn. To him, Jason was just another man. But Jason couldn't take his eyes off him. I missed everything, he said to me quietly. You chose to, I replied. He nodded slowly, absorbing the weight. I've been angry at the wrong person, he admitted. You didn't betray me, you protected him. I looked at Eli, who was now coloring at the front desk. I protected us both. Jason's eyes filled. What now? I sighed. Now, you live with the choices you made. But he's my son. I didn't flinch. Biologically, maybe. But he calls someone else daddy, the man who stayed, the man who earned it. Jason sat down, crumbling. I was scared. I let Brielle manipulate me because I wanted to believe I wasn't the fool. And now, I asked. Now I know I was worse than a fool. I was a coward. For the first time, I didn't feel pity. I didn't feel rage. I felt clarity. Brielle tried once more. She sent flowers, letters, even posted a carefully filtered photo of her and the baby with a vague caption, healing, hope, honesty. I ignored them all. Because I wasn't playing that game anymore. One Sunday, I took Eli to the beach. Mr. Whitaker met us there. He held Eli's hand as we walked along the sand. The wind was cold, but my heart was steady. Jason never called again. And Brielle? She faded, a shadow in my past. I stood at the shoreline, watching Eli race ahead with a stick, chasing waves. Mr. Whitaker stood beside me, silent but solid. I used to think I needed closure, I said. And now? He asked. I smiled. Now I just need peace. Scandal doesn't just ruin reputations, it shatters illusions. When the truth about Brielle broke, it wasn't just Jason who was humiliated. My parents, who had paraded her as the perfect daughter, were dragged through the mud by association. Whispers turned into headlines. Paris affair rocks business family. Paternity lies and wedding deceit. Their phones stopped ringing, invitations ceased, old allies withdrew with polite distance. For the first time, Brielle wasn't the darling, she was the disappointment. And my parents didn't take it well. They distanced themselves quickly. Statements were made, apologies issued to investors, even a public photo, just the two of them, at a charity event, smiling as if Brielle had never existed. She had begged them to stand by her, but loyalty is expensive when tied to image, and theirs had already taken a hit. Jason didn't fare much better. The news spread through professional circles like wildfire. Investors questioned his judgment, partners backed out of pending deals, one major contract was pulled at the last minute. He lost everything he'd built trying to maintain a lie. He tried to stay above it, quiet, composed. But behind closed doors I heard, he crumbled. He reached out once more, a letter this time. "I don't expect forgiveness," he wrote, "but I do hope one day Eli might know who I was before I lost myself." I didn't respond. Because Eli already had a father. He was the man who read bedtime stories, fixed broken toys, taught him how to ride a bike in the park behind our building. Mr. Whitaker didn't try to replace anything, but to Eli he was Dad. And that was enough. When Eli asked one evening, "Why don't I have the same last name as Daddy?" I paused. Mr. Whitaker smiled. "Names are just letters. What matters is who shows up." Eli nodded and went back to his drawing. I looked at the man beside me, the one who'd helped rebuild everything I thought I'd lost, and I felt no regret for the choices I'd made. Jason had made his, so had Brielle. Now they were living with the consequences. And I was finally free of them. I was finally free of them. Brielle moved back into the guest house behind my parents' estate for a while, but the main doors no longer opened for her the way they used to. They kept their distance emotionally and physically. Family dinners stopped. Her name was avoided in public. Even her own mother wouldn't meet her eyes. She had once claimed the spotlight. Now she lived in the shadows. She tried to reclaim control, posting curated photos, vague quotes about redemption and motherhood, but the likes dwindled, the comments turned bitter, and slowly she disappeared from the public's interest. Jason, meanwhile, poured himself into work, but the damage was irreversible. One firm canceled their contract citing reputational risk. Another cited moral breach. He fired his publicist, hired a crisis team, but nothing stuck. The whispers were louder than any rebuttal. He called me one night. I let it ring. Then came a voicemail, his voice raw. I see him in my dreams, and in them he runs toward me, but I always wake up before he gets there. I deleted it. Not out of cruelty, but because I didn't want to let even a memory of his voice back in. Mr. Whitaker and I took things slow. He never pushed. He just showed up again and again. He built Eli a wooden train set by hand for his birthday, sat through parent-teacher conferences, learned how to braid my hair on a whim because Eli thought Mommy should look fancy today. He was steady, strong, and kind. One afternoon, as we sat on a picnic blanket in the park, Eli curled against his side and asked, "Can I be a Whitaker too?" Tears pricked my eyes. Mr. Whitaker smiled and kissed the top of his head. "You already are." And just like that, the past no longer mattered, because our present was finally ours. It was a small wedding. Just a few friends, a sunset by the shore, and 2 children tossing flower petals ahead of me as I walked barefoot down the sand. Mr. Whitaker, Andrew now, in the way I called him only when I wanted to feel close, I stood waiting, in a navy suit with a shy smile that said everything I needed to know. Eli held my hand until the last second, then ran to join his sister Emma, holding her tiny bouquet, with a focus only a 5-year-old could muster. We said our vows with the waves behind us and the wind in our hair. No grandeur, no spectacle, just promises whispered like truth. I never thought I'd find this again, peace, love, a home, but I had. And it didn't come in the form I once dreamed of. It came quietly, steadily, in healing, in trust, in the slow build of days without pain. Eli was 6 now, curious and full of joy. He adored Emma, who had her father's eyes and a mischievous streak that kept us on our toes. Together, they were our whole world. We made a home filled with mismatched furniture, canvases in progress, and laughter that echoed through the halls. Sometimes, I'd catch myself staring out the kitchen window, remembering the girl I used to be, the one who thought love had to hurt to be real. She was gone now, or maybe she had just grown up. I never reached out to Jason again, and Brielle had long vanished into her own silence. There was no revenge, no dramatic reckoning. Just life, moving on. The betrayal that once shattered me was now a scar. It didn't ache, it didn't bleed, but it was there, a quiet reminder of how far I'd come. One afternoon, Emma asked, "Was Mommy always your wife, Daddy?" Andrew smiled and said, "No, sweetheart, but I always hoped she would be." And in that moment, I realized something. I wasn't surviving anymore. I was living. And that made all the difference. Some nights, after the kids had gone to bed, I'd lie beside Andrew and talk about the lives we used to live. He'd tell me about the years after his wife died, how empty the house had felt. how he never imagined he'd smile again. I tell him about the night I watched my sister marry the man I loved, and how I smiled through tears that tasted like defeat. But now, those stories felt like another life, not forgotten, just quiet. We didn't pretend our pasts didn't exist. We honored them, then let them go. I no longer felt the urge to compare, to wonder, what if? Because what I had now was real. It was built from patience and pain and the courage to begin again. Emma, with her endless questions, often reminded me of myself as a child, so eager to understand the world. Ellie, gentle and observant, seemed older than his years. He once told me, "I like when Daddy paints with us. He listens better than other grown-ups." And it was true. Andrew listened, with his eyes, with his hands, with the kind of attention that made people feel safe. On our first anniversary, he gave me a small sketchbook. On the first page, he had drawn me sitting on the gallery floor, Eli in my lap, both of us laughing. Underneath it, he wrote, "Thank you for choosing to stay." I cried. Of course I did. Because staying was the bravest thing I had ever done. The biggest lesson I learned wasn't about betrayal, it was about worth. About knowing that no matter who leaves or what's taken, you still deserve to be loved in a way that doesn't hurt. And maybe, just maybe, the heart doesn't break to destroy us. Maybe it breaks to let the light in.